I want to thank Aaron for that and say that he introduced me as everything but the job I enjoyed most, and that is being mayor of the city. And it was the one I enjoyed most because this is where the rubber hits the road. Everything you think about, everything you dream about, we have an opportunity to do together right within about a 50, 60 mile perimeter. But I think the answer to the question you pose for me is the challenge of real diversity. And it's quite simple. One is to celebrate diversity as a blessing. That's the challenge. To see it not as a problem, but to see it as a blessing for us all. Now, I had no choice about this. I grew up in a neighborhood that was quite diverse. An Irish bar on one corner, an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on the other corner. The German-American Bund was on the third corner. And I was 50 yards in the middle of the block, surrounded by all of these, and we happened to be the only black children. There were other black people in the neighborhood in New Orleans, but we were the only black children. So from 2 years old on, I had to deal with the challenge of diversity. And I learned that this was an advantage. I moved to New York as a young minister working with the National Council of Churches and got another dose. Then, though, it was much more critical because while it was me in New Orleans, in New York, it was dealing with my children. And that's where the problem comes. We had, again, the Irish and French and German, but here we had Hispanic and Asians right in the 6 houses around me. It's different because by that time I had a little girl. In fact, I had 2. And you go across the street and your daughter's playing with a little German girl and everybody's drinking beer. And I'm a good old-fashioned Protestant. That's a challenge. The French had wine every day for dinner. I mean, they had wine ordered by the case. They delivered a case of wine to my French neighbors like they delivered a case of Coca-Cola to my mother in New Orleans. So you had these cultural challenges, and that's where it becomes a test. And fortunately, I think because of my religious background and theological studies, the story of Abraham and sacrificing Isaac, the rubber met the road when it came time to my 4-year-old to go to public school. Only choice, because it was the only school available and we couldn't have afforded any other, and it was 4 blocks away. And I said to Jean, you know, we can't protect this child. The only thing we can do is trust this child to God and pray. Now that's a bold move. But we said we couldn't. She was getting a graduate degree at Queens College. I was working in Manhattan. It was impossible to walk her to school every day. And so we said we'll walk her to school 3 days and let her know, and then the 4th day we'll expect her to go on her own. Now, she said I was crazy. And that's one of the biggest fights we had, because what do you do with a 4-year-old in New York City? And we were both from the South. She's from a town of 3,000. We had more people in the 4 blocks than in New York than she had in Marion, Alabama. But our child had to learn to live in New York. Interesting thing happened. Because she knew she was going to have to find her own way to school, by the 2nd day, she had organized a little rat pack of 4-year-olds that met on our corner. And all we had to do as parents was take them to the corner and put them together. And then about 6 of them walked the 4 blocks together. I'm saying that by not trying to protect your children too much when they're young, you really help them to grow, to appreciate and celebrate the diversity of opportunity in their lives. And you prepare them better for the world in which they must live, the sooner they get started at it. The longer you protect your children, the more difficult you're making their life. And the more you're confusing it. If we understand that, then I think we begin to celebrate and take advantage of these opportunities. When it came time for her as an Atlanta public school student to go to France for a summer at 14, it was no problem. She did that. And Atlanta public schools were taking kids to Paris and studying in France. Let's see, she's been out of college 20 years almost. But that's a long time back. That the advantages and the opportunities that were afforded by their experience in these public schools allowed them to be successful. And I can brag a little bit because all of my kids are out of college. All of them went through Atlanta public schools. All of them had all of the problems you have in Atlanta. And they learned to deal with those problems while they were 12 to 17 when we could help them. And they don't have to deal with those problems now that they're in their 30s and 40s and when I'm in the 50s. Diversity is life. This is my father's world, we used to sing in church. Everybody, and my theological belief is that every human being on the face of this earth is created in the image of God, that there's something of God, there's something of the divine, something of creation in each and every individual. And the challenge of diversity is learning about God and God's understanding of this planet through the individuals with whom we come in contact. Now, this has been a blessing for Atlanta. Atlanta wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for the diversity. The black community, the original Diverse Challenge, was very, very difficult. But no city worked at it anymore. And the business community took the lead. And the city produced a wide variety of leadership. Both Hartsfield and Ivan Allen were way ahead of their time. Though both were segregationists, they understood we had to move beyond that. And they pushed the community to do that. Daddy King and William Borders and Martin Luther King Jr., Benjamin Mays created what I call a leadership factory that prepared leaders in this city to give leadership all over the world. Jimmy Carter out of Plains is a product of the leadership factory that was produced in this city. When we began to dry up in terms of federal money, when the economy began to go global in the 70s, it was the fact that we had an emerging international community that prepared us. The Olympics was probably the culmination of that. But before we got to the Olympics, we had 1,100 companies move into Atlanta from all over the world. And they brought with them during the 80s about $70 billion and created more than 1 million jobs. So this was a positive diversity. Anybody that looks at their balance sheets in 1970 and compares them with their budgets now can count their blessings in terms of real dollars, even though those dollars may have been converted from yen and from marks and from francs and the other currencies of the world, pesos. But there's some factors that we don't realize. More Africans came to America from 1970 to the present than came during the slave trade. And the difference was that the second most educated group of people coming to the United States since the 70s has been people from Africa, or people of African descent, because the turmoil, the wars, the difficulties in Africa drove out the educated people. The people who were coming in here from Cuba, from Jamaica, from the Caribbean, even from Haiti, tended to be quite often people who came to get an education and couldn't go back. If you look at the Iranians, if you look at the people from Colombia, from Brazil, they came here seeking and searching for opportunity and education. They got it. They went back if their countries were willing to receive them, but many of the countries were in turmoil and were threatened by the return of many educated people. So they stayed here and they helped us grow the economy. We would not have gotten the Olympics if we had not been the international city that we are. And I look at these in terms of real dollars. I figured that to keep integration going, and when I say integration, I mean everybody, to keep us working together, celebrating our differences and profiting by them, we had to generate almost 10% economic growth a year. There's almost nobody in the world doing that, but we've almost done it every single year since the 60s. And that's another reason why our growth has been successful. When the first Hispanic migration came here in 1970, Sam Massell had asked me to be the chairman of the Community Relations Commission with Archbishop Donnellan of the Catholic Church. And when we realized there was a big infusion of Hispanic immigrants, the Community Relations Commission said, well, the first thing we have to do is translate all our documents into Spanish. We have to make it easy to assimilate. We have to welcome them in. It was almost as though, because we had so much trouble dealing with each other as black and white, everybody else coming in got a free ride. The Asians were welcome because they too, for the most part, had come with education, with some skills, and were bringing opportunity with them. And so that was the reason why we won the Olympics. And it was the Olympics that carried us through the 90s and has helped us to establish the image of an international city that we enjoy today. Now, in the middle of that, we also see this as a challenge that we are the only city or region that has been in the top 10 of African, Hispanic, and Asian immigration. But I don't think we have seen it as a real problem. And it has not been a problem. It's a challenge. It has not been a problem because we have developed an experience of working together. When I was with this group, just a meeting at the Atlanta Regional Commission, which for much of that time was chaired by Manuel Malouf, a Lebanese chairman of CEO of DeKalb County, Lillian Webb from Gwinnett, Ernest Barrett from Cobb, and me from Atlanta, and Michael Lomax from Fulton. We never had a racial discussion. We talked water and sewer. We talked that river corridor. We talked transportation. And what we realized was that the diversity, if you take it for granted and appreciate it, is a blessing, and it enhances your understanding and discussion of everything else that's important. And I think we've been able to grow primarily because we have grown together. Now let me come to a conclusion of this. The reason why this is very, very important and why we can do nothing other than what we're doing, and that is to celebrate diversity, is that diversity is not politically driven. Diversity is scientifically and technologically driven. that we have no choice about a global economy. We're either going to work in it and compete in it, or we're going to be left behind. And if we look at the early immigrations and see how they have profited, the worst immigration problem that the U.S. probably faced was the Irish invasion of Massachusetts. And the Irish were persecuted every bit as bad, almost as blacks, in the South. But the Irish persisted, they made it politically, they got well educated, and then the third generation went back to Ireland. And they bought up everything in Ireland. Do you know that Ireland has the highest per capita income of any country in Europe now? That Ireland is leading Europe in exports? That the Irish business community is one of the most visionary and progressive. All of them were American educated. And they went back to Ireland and they took off. I remember when I was in the Congress in the 70s, we couldn't understand how Italy couldn't keep a government. They were always, governments were falling every 6 months. But Italy was leading Europe in trade even back then. And as I hung around a little longer, I began to understand that these were little mom and pop sewing circles that were sending stuff into the United States sort of in an underground kind of export trade. But they were being financed by a partnership of Italian Americans and their relatives back home. Now we know them as Armani and Versace and Gucci, and they lead the world of fashion now. And they are big international companies in which we're involved. There's nothing that's going to happen in Ireland and Italy that's not a partnership between Irish Americans and Italian Americans. But the same thing is true of Nigerians. Nigerians came here, and Ghanaians are very well educated. Nigerians are now sending back $4.5 billion every year to Nigeria. Ghanaians are sending back $2 billion a year to Ghana. But Koreans are sending back money to Korea. The Chinese American community, the reason that Aaron and I were in China was Chinese Americans who were trying to really kind of protect themselves because they didn't know exactly what was going to happen at the end of when Hong Kong became integrated in China. And they were trying to spread out their assets, and we were trying to get them to spread as much as possible in Atlanta. But the growth and development in China. When I went to China, well, been there several times, but every time I go there, I realize more and more that the industrial development of China is being led by Chinese who were educated in the United States of America and have gone back to China to build up their economies. I see the economic and social and cultural diversity as the path to peace through progress. The alternative is isolationism, protectionism, and that's what usually leads to war and ultimately famine. But it's even more finely tuned than that. We've seen some terrible tragedies in the world. We were in Yugoslavia. I was in Yugoslavia in the 70s as U.S. ambassador, and I fell in love with Belgrade. And I thought that Yugoslavia was the most ethnically diverse and interesting country in Europe because of its diversity. But then the Berlin Wall fell down, communism fell, the Yugoslav economy went into a 10-year decline. And with 10 years of recession and an economic depression, we developed the demagogues that turned people who were working together into enemies of each other. And we saw one of the worst bloodsheds of our time as Bosnia and Serbia split up what was potentially a beautiful country. And so it scares me when when countries start getting insecure economically and splitting up. We saw it in Rwanda, where people who were some tall and some short, they're all black, they're all of them were Catholics. And still 1 million people were killed in 90 days because of a widening class alienation that had been ignored for over 100 years. And when population growth and economic decline came together, instead of coming together to solve the problems, they turned on each other. And so the challenge for us, and I remind myself of this all the time, that we can continue working together and celebrating differences and understanding diversity as a blessing. And that's the only logical, intelligent choice that we have. If we begin to make these paranoid, insecure, fearful choices, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I face the fact that 10 years of recession and this beautiful experiment in diversity could implode without the kind of leadership, without the kind of sensitivity, without the kind of understanding. And we have a very fragile socioeconomic environment. And we put it to real strains, as I guess I've been guilty of doing recently in the recent election. But ultimately, we've got to know that we are one people. We are God's people by whatever process, theology, or name we understand that. None of us created ourselves. Deepak Chopra says that we think of ourselves as human beings having a spiritual, occasional spiritual experience, when in truth, we're probably more accurate spiritual beings who are here having an occasional and very temporary human experience. Seeing that experience as part of the divine, celebrating the diversity with which God has blessed us, is our only hope.